Hello. Today we are going to be examining the history of ancient Persia. This is an area that is interacts with some of the regions that we have touched upon already. For example, is Cyrus the Great, who appears um, quite in quite positive tones in the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible. The um, Mesopotamian cultures are related in some sense with the ancient Persians, to the extent that you have the Assyrians coming in and um, conquering that region, and you have the beginnings of the Persian Empire as it founds itself in part with rebellion from the against the Assyrians. So the time that we're talking about is pretty long period, starting roughly 2000 BCE, going to 637. The beginning period, obviously, we don't is shrouded in mystery, like so many ancient cultures. Before we get to the period of empire, we have a long period of settlement, centuries upon centuries of people settling in the region that later becomes the Persian Empire. Um, unlike the other areas that we talk about, the other um, civilizations, early civilizations that are based around a river, the Persian Empire actually develops on the Iranian, what is sometimes called the Iranian Plateau. It's protected by mountains. It's a relatively high in altitude. There are some advantages to this location. It's easier to defend. On the other hand, some areas tend to be rather arid. When we talk about the Persian Empire, it's created from more or less a fusion between two separate tribes, the Medes and the Persians. The Assyrians had, as I mentioned, um, conquered this area and dominated both tribes. But of course, nothing lasts forever, and the Assyrians themselves suffered from civil conflict. And when this conflict developed, internal conflict within Assyria, there was room for rebellion. So Cyrus the Great is really the principal figure in the creation of the Persian Empire. He is the figure that plays a dominant role in conquering the neighboring tribes and establishing something that we can call an empire. Like so many stories of foundation, the history of Cyrus is shrouded in myth. If you read this history, and you probably hear echoes of other stories. You might think, for example, about stories of Moses. a child that is um, destined to be killed, um, but the people who are supposed to kill the child don't, and somehow the child survives and grows up and does great things, things that have been foretold before. And this is the case with Cyrus. Um, Despite the best efforts of the people who had been warned that Cyrus was going to be um, coming to power, um, despite those efforts to thwart fate, Cyrus, in fact, does take power. And about 550 BC, we see him um, establishing his rule over the Achaemenid Empire. Um, the At its height, the empire it stretches all the way from what we sometimes would call Babylonia um, into the areas that are to the east of modern Iran. He is regarded as the father of the of his people. Um, he has a good reputation um, in the ancient world. Actually, he has a reputation for being um, wise and generous as a conqueror. He did, of course, engage in warfare, but he also used diplomacy uh, and used both techniques to put his the area that he ruled together. Um, he is reputed to have come to a violent end, which is perhaps not surprising for um, an emperor in that day and age. He was um, fighting a tribe a nomadic tribe that ranged all across what we might say would be from Russia, Central Asia, the Scythians, um, and he captured the one of the princes in of the Scythians, and that prince committed suicide. The mother was enraged and was able to in turn kill Cyrus, and so it was one of those legendary episodes of the ancient world. Whether this happened or not, it could have. Um, it Something to think about. What sort of why would this story get passed down? Is this something that perhaps reflects on the savagery of the Scythians? Try to be aware of when you're reading these various accounts about what sort of motivations might lie behind the um, behind behind spreading these stories. What sort of message do they send? As I mentioned, comes up repeatedly in the Old Testament. Um, Not surprisingly, the Jews were quite favorably disposed to him because he had freed them when he conquered um, the rulers of Babylonia, and he was able to he freed them, and they were able to go back to Israel. So this was obviously very positive. He's even talked about by Herodotus. You have an excerpt for this week to read from him, where this ancient Greek historian writes about the Persians. He is sometimes described as the father of history, um, in the sense that he attempts to write an unbiased history. And in fact, there are some areas where that people thought that Herodotus was just making things up, and it was just unbelievable. But in fact, there's some good evidence that what he was talking about actually happened. The Canal of Xerxes, for example, was something that for centuries people thought was just legendary. In fact, recently there was some archaeological research that discovered this actually was an event and a construction project that happened in the ancient world. Um, so I think this is something that we are finding, we often are finding, that um, we underestimate what the people in the ancient world were capable of. The next big ruler of that is important in Persian history and Greek history is Darius. Darius is notable because it is under Darius that we um, see this long conflict with Greece, and we'll talk more about that when we get to the unit on Greece. Um, this is these long Perso-Grecan wars that eventually they have a huge impact on Greece, obviously, and also on the impact. They have an impact on Western civilization. Um, this war is one of the more notable things about it is that you have the very powerful empire fighting against an relatively upstart power, that is Greece. And um, the Greeks, in a sense, are victorious just by surviving and keeping their independence. It's not like at that point the Greeks conquer Persia by any means. That is not the story. Although later we see that with Alexander the Great. That's a little bit, that comes later though. So the um, the conflict between the Greeks and the Persians is long lasting. It the Greeks, as I say, maintain their independence. The construction and um, construction projects of the ancient Persia are incredibly impressive. Uh, the capital city, uh, Persepolis, is one of the great metropolitan areas of the ancient world. Um, the Greeks are also notable for constructing the um, their road, um, the road construction, the sometimes called the Royal Road, later serves as as one of the key parts of what we later call the Silk Road. Um, the culture is complex. Um, a lot of attention to valuing art, and there is a relatively good position for women in Persian society. It is polygamy is allowed, but it's generally at the for something for the upper classes. Um, there is slavery, which is not surprising in the ancient world, but it's not one of the more. It's not an institution that dominates the culture as it does, for example, in Roman culture. It's not nearly as as playing that overwhelming part. There's an example of some of the artistry of the ancient Persians. Notice the motifs, a lot of motifs of the wildlife of that area in that time. Now, the ancient city of Persepolis was destroyed by Alexander the Great and his soldiers when they overran it. And this is centuries after Cyrus. One of the reasons that the Persians are notable, one of their contributions in the ancient world, is Zoroastrianism. Zoroastrianism is one of the, sometimes regarded as the first monotheistic religion, if not the first, it's certainly one of the first. Monotheistic means only of having only one God. So, the God, the good God is Mazda, although Mazda is seen as having an evil twin. So this is sort of this perception of the world as being divided into good and bad, and there is this battle that is occurring in the world between the good and the bad. There was an elaborate setup for the religion, the priests and temples. Sometimes it's seen as a worship of fire, but I think that's probably a simplification. There was a sacred fire that was kept in the temples. There were different ranks of priests. The highest level priests actually helped write some of the sacred texts. At the lower levels, they were called magi. And if you're again familiar with the nativity story of the New Testament, you might remember the three magi, the visiting wise men, sometimes called the wise men. Those are generally understood to be Zoroastrian priests who were coming. And of course, they, as all priests of the ancient world, they were people who watched the night sky very carefully. So they would have been, if there were signs in the heavens, they would have been aware of them. So we have this, as I mentioned, this dichotomy that is set up in the worldview of good and bad, water and fire. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but there is this coexistence and dependence that is developed within the faith of Zoroastrianism. The influence, because it is one of the oldest religions, the influence especially in that region was great. When we talk about the Abrahamic traditions, that means the Abrahamic traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that many people look at Zoroastrianism as being a cultural root of elements that later get reflected in the religions of Islam, Christianity, and Judaism. Now, you might wonder, well, what happened to the Zoroastrians? There are very few, if any, in the region where it developed. That would have been Persia or modern-day Iran. The conflict with Islam essentially forced the Zoroastrians out. They did not win that ideological battle. There are still Zoroastrians, a small group of practicing Zoroastrians in modern India, and over the centuries, it had spread. Zoroastrian had spread from Persia to other um, areas of Central Asia, Azerbaijan, Uzbekistan, and you still see to this day. You see elements of the religion in rituals. For example, in that region, the main holiday is the spring equinox, and it is celebrated by building bonfires and jumping over the bonfires as a rite of purification. Again, you can see the influence of the role of fire in this ritual. Um, Zoroastrianism, one of the reasons it was so powerful within the Persian Empire, it actually worked quite well for the rulers. The In the theology that was developed at that time, the emperors were perceived as agents of God on earth. And so obviously it was um, good for people to respect them and pay attention to them. They're also one of the positive things about Zoroastrianism, and this is not completely uniform because there were different branches of Zoroastrianism, but in general there tended to be a respect for other cultures. There was not an emphasis on proselytizing or converting everybody in the past to Zoroastrianism. It was much more benign than that. Um, so this is an important element to consider. Um, we mentioned the confrontation with Greece. Um, the Persian wars lasted for decades and were very widespread. This map shows you just a little bit of the impact. You can think of the Persian Empire at this point dominating the modern day Turkey, or sometimes called the Anatolian Peninsula. So that's that green um, shaded area, and into the area that we now would consider, the Balkan Peninsula, say. And the Greeks were successful at holding off the Persians from their attempts to subjugate the entire region. So there are people who look at this and say this battle, um, especially battles such as Thermopylae and where the Persians were held off, were really key in the development of Western civilization because the Greeks had breathing space, so to speak, to develop their institutions, for example, of democracy. And of course, we don't know what would have happened if battles had gone the other way. But as it happened, Greek culture survived in a way that it probably would not have if the Persians had been successful in subjugating that region. Um, so the after the after these series of battles, the battles of Salamis was particularly notable in as I said, in holding off the Persians. There is a stalemate of sorts, and after the Peloponnesian War, a treaty is signed, and the Persians, more or less have to accept the fact that they are not going to subjugate that entire set of islands and Greek cities. Now, the irony is that after that treaty is signed, we have the emergence of what is called Macedonia, Macedonian, and starting out with um, Philip of the Macedon, and he comes in from the north essentially, and conquers these city states that have been fighting with each other and were so weakened because of the Peloponnesian War. Um, and after he is able to do this, his son um, takes power upon his death. Some people think that Alexander the Great or Alexander the Great's mother basically assassinates Philip the Great. These things are you know unclear, let's just say, but there's it is alleged by some people that was the case. In any case, Alexander the Great, you're probably familiar with his story. As I said, we're going to talk more about it when we get to Greece. But for our purposes, the main point is that he, among the areas that Alexander the Great conquers, is what had been um, the Persian Empire. So Alexander the Great, wonderful military leader, but he didn't live very long. And after he died, essentially his generals split up the territory that was conquered into separate kingdoms. So you have the Seleucid kingdom basically occupying the area that had been Persian, um, the Persian Empire. This is succeeded by the Parthians. Parthians have been a tribe in Central Asia, and they were able to more or less take control of that area. And in this period, we don't really know what, just to kind of touch on the culture at that time. We don't really know what's happening to the religious faith at that time. It appears that much of the sacred texts and perhaps the substance of the religion had been destroyed by the invasion of Alexander the Great. This gives you an indication of these successor empires. As you can see, they're occupying a part of what had been the Persian Empire, a large part of it. So we have the contours are relatively similar. And finally, we have the Sasanian Empire, which is another tribal group that takes over the area and is, in its own right, very developed militarily. This is one of the entities that the Romans are repeatedly warring against, and they are weakened by the conflicts with the Romans, so that eventually they fall to the Arabs who had converted to Islam, and so we have this sort of cultural continuity that is really shifts with that conquest. So a little bit about the Sassanid Empire. A few things that were sort of interesting. I mean, you have one of the things I think is sort of interesting is this slavery is relatively rare in this empire, which is again in contrast to the Romans, where slavery is dominant. and really dominates the economy. Um, this gives you a little bit of a timeline for the period that we're talking about. So many centuries, a succession of political entities that are occupying the area that Cyrus had originally pulled together under the Achaemenid Empire. So the names change, but there's a lot of cultural continuity um, through this through these centuries in this region, and a very high level of civilization. Um, so I think it's important that we recognize that.